My name is Natalie Pierce, and for 29 years I've been the family footnote. The daughter they introduce last, the one they forget to include in holiday cards, the sister who exists in the negative space between accomplishments that matter. I arrived at Victoria's engagement party exactly on time, carrying a Tiffany-wrapped gift that cost more than most people's rent, wearing a dress I'd chosen carefully to be appropriate but not attention-seeking. I parked my car 3 blocks away because the circular driveway was reserved for important guests. I am not apparently an important guest. The garden behind my parents' Ashford Hills estate had been transformed into something out of a bridal magazine. Rose gold lanterns swayed between oak trees, their light catching on crystal that hung from a white pavilion like frozen rain. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Blush pink roses climbed trellises that hadn't existed last month, and a champagne fountain bubbled near the center of it all, surrounded by women in cocktail dresses who laughed with their heads thrown back, performing joy for an audience that was always watching. My sister stood at the heart of it, her left hand extended so the enormous diamond on her finger could catch every possible angle of light. She wore white, which felt premature but very much like Victoria, already practicing for the main event. Her laugh carried across the lawn, wind chimes made of self-satisfaction. I looked for my name on the seating chart, a calligraphied masterpiece displayed on an easel near the entrance. It took me a moment to find it because they'd spelled it wrong. Natalie Pierce, table 7. I didn't correct the error. I'd learned years ago that correcting people only made them defensive, and defensive people find ways to make you pay for their embarrassment. Table 7 was tucked behind the bar, partially obscured by the catering tent. The singles table, I realized looking at the other names. 2 teenage cousins I'd met once at a funeral, Victoria's college roommate's younger brother, and an elderly aunt who I was relatively certain had dementia. This was where you put people you invited out of obligation but hoped wouldn't stay long. I sat down in a white folding chair that creaked under my weight and placed my clutch on the table. The centerpiece was smaller than the others, the roses slightly wilted. No one had bothered to fix it because no one important would see it. From where I sat, I could see everything and be seen by no one. It was a position I'd occupied my entire life. The waitstaff moved through the crowd with trays of hors d'oeuvres that looked too beautiful to eat. Bacon-wrapped dates, phyllo cups filled with something that glistened, tiny spoons holding what might have been caviar. None of them came near table 7. We weren't on the route, apparently. I watched my mother move through the garden like a swan, her silver dress catching light, her smile practiced and perfect. She stopped to embrace Victoria, both of them turning slightly so the photographer could capture the moment. My father stood near the pavilion with a rocks glass in his hand, nodding at something another man in a blazer was saying. He looked proud, chest slightly puffed, the father of a daughter who'd done everything right. I wondered if he remembered he had 2 daughters. Probably not in this moment. In this moment, there was only Victoria, radiant and accomplished, newly promoted and newly engaged to a man who looked like he'd been ordered from a catalog of acceptable husbands. Derek Morrison stood beside her now, his hand on the small of her back, smiling at guests with the ease of someone who'd never questioned whether he belonged somewhere. Tall, clean-cut, expensive watch, good teeth. He worked at Morrison & Associates, a boutique consulting firm that Victoria never stopped talking about. She joined them 3 years ago and had been climbing steadily ever since, or at least that's what every family dinner conversation suggested. Last Christmas, she'd spent 45 minutes explaining the intricacies of a client portfolio she'd secured, using words like synergy and stakeholder engagement, while my parents listened like she was delivering the Sermon on the Mount. When she finally paused and my mother asked what I'd been up to, I'd mentioned a project I was working on. My father cut me off halfway through the second sentence to ask if anyone wanted more wine. That's how it had always been. Victoria's stories had weight, substance, a place at the table. Mine were interruptions, filler between the moments that mattered. I thought about leaving. I could claim a headache, congratulate Victoria quickly, and be back in my Boston apartment before the cake was cut. No one would miss me. They might not even notice until someone counted chairs at the end of the night and wondered why there was an extra piece of tiramisu. But something kept me seated. Maybe stubbornness. Maybe the quiet knowledge that tonight was going to be different, even if I was the only one who knew it yet. A young woman in a black vest and bow tie approached the table with a tray of champagne flutes. She offered them to the teenagers first, who giggled and took them even though they were clearly underage. When she got to me, she paused, her eyes meeting mine for just a second longer than necessary. She set a glass down gently in front of me, not like she was serving but like she was offering. Her name tag said Jennifer. Something about her careful movements made me think she was working her way through college, that this job wasn't a career but a means to something else. I wanted to tell her to keep going, to not let anyone convince her she wasn't worth the effort. Instead, I just said thank you. She nodded and moved on, but I saw her glance back once before disappearing into the catering tent. The sun was setting now, turning the garden golden. Someone adjusted the lanterns so they glowed brighter against the coming dusk. A microphone squealed briefly, then settled into silence as my father stepped up to the small platform near the pavilion. He tapped the microphone twice, that universal signal that someone was about to make a speech. The crowd quieted, turning toward him with wine glasses raised in anticipation. This is it, I thought. The moment where Victoria gets every word she's ever wanted, wrapped in applause and validation. My father cleared his throat, smiling broadly. He looked distinguished up there, silver-haired and confident, every inch the successful patriarch. When he spoke, his voice carried across the garden with practiced ease. He'd given a lot of speeches in his life. Toasts at the country club, presentations at board meetings, grace at Thanksgiving dinners where he thanked God for blessing our family so abundantly. Tonight, he said, we celebrate not one but two incredible achievements. He gestured toward Victoria, who stood beside Derek with her hand in his, her face arranged in an expression of humble gratitude that I knew she'd practiced. My daughter Victoria has always been exceptional. From the time she was a little girl, we knew she was destined for great things. The crowd murmured agreement. Someone said, "Hear, hear." My mother dabbed at her eyes with a cocktail napkin even though she wasn't actually crying. She's worked tirelessly to build her career, my father continued, and this week that hard work paid off. Victoria has been promoted to senior consultant at one of the most prestigious firms in the Northeast. The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. Victoria smiled wider, ducking her head slightly in a way that was meant to seem modest but came across as rehearsed. My father waited for the noise to die down before continuing. And as if that wasn't enough to celebrate, she's also found her perfect partner. He turned to Derek, extending his free hand. Derek, we couldn't be happier to welcome you into our family. You're exactly the kind of man we always hoped Victoria would. Fine. Derek shook his hand firmly, playing his part perfectly. More applause, more murmurs of approval. I took a sip of my champagne. It was excellent, probably $200 a bottle. My father knew his wines. He was about to step down, his speech apparently complete, when Victoria reached for the microphone. He handed it to her with an indulgent smile, the way you hand things to someone who's never been told no. Victoria's voice filled the garden, bright and clear and absolutely certain of its welcome. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. This means the world to me. She paused, scanning the crowd, her eyes touching on faces that mattered. Donors, family, friends, colleagues, people who could do something for her someday. Her gaze slid past table 7 without stopping. I've been so blessed, she continued. Blessed with parents who supported every dream. Blessed with opportunities to prove myself. Blessed with Derek, who saw something in me worth forever. She turned to him, and they shared a look that was probably genuine but felt like performance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Faced the crowd again, her expression shifted slightly, a shadow of something harder moving beneath the surface. You know, she said, her tone turning conspiratorial. Growing up, I always felt this pressure to succeed. To be the daughter who made our family proud. She paused for effect, letting the words land. It wasn't easy, especially when you're constantly compared to, well, to someone who doesn't quite have the same drive. A few people shifted uncomfortably. My mother's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. But I learned that success isn't just about working hard. It's about wanting it. It's about refusing to settle for mediocrity. She was looking in my direction now, not quite at me but close enough that people would follow her gaze. Some people are content with small lives, small ambitions, small contributions. And that's fine. Not everyone is meant for greatness. But some of us refuse to be ordinary. The air changed. What had been a celebration was curdling into something else, something meaner. She raised her glass higher, her smile sharp as cut crystal. So here's to those of us who dare to dream big. To those of us who refuse to be a disgrace to the family name. The word landed like a slap. Disgrace. She'd said it lightly, almost as an afterthought, but everyone heard it. Everyone understood who she meant. My teenage cousins looked down at their phones. The elderly aunt asked someone to repeat what was said. My father chuckled uncomfortably and started clapping, trying to move past the moment. The crowd followed his lead, applause filling the garden again. But it sounded different now. Uncertain. Guilty. I didn't move. I didn't reach for my champagne. I didn't smooth my dress or check my phone or do any of the small things people do when they're trying to disappear. I just sat there, hands folded in my lap, and let the moment wash over me. Because here's what Victoria didn't know. Here's what none of them knew. 3 years ago, when Morrison and Associates was drowning in debt and facing bankruptcy, I bought them. Not as Natalie Pierce, the family disappointment who couldn't hold down a real job. As in, Pierce, CEO of Pierce Strategic Group, the private equity firm I'd built from nothing while they were all too busy noticing Victoria to see what I was doing. I restructured their leadership, refinanced their debt, opened 2 new regional offices. I saved that company, and then I made it profitable. Derek Morrison reports to a regional director named Patricia Voss. Patricia reports to the corporate board. I chair that board. Every promotion Victoria has received in the last 3 years crossed my desk. Every raise, every performance review, every client portfolio she's bragged about at family dinners. I approved them all. Not because she's my sister, but because despite everything, she's competent at her job. I don't let personal feelings interfere with business decisions. That's why I'm successful. That's why I own 7 companies across 4 states. While my family thinks I work in some vague administrative role that I'm too embarrassed to discuss. Last month, Derek sent a proposal to corporate requesting budget approval for a new consulting vertical. It was a good proposal, well-researched and carefully argued. I approved it in a video call where my camera was off and my voice was filtered through Patricia, who presented it as coming from the executive level. Derek has no idea he's ever interacted with me. Victoria has no idea that every success she's celebrated, every milestone she's used to prove her superiority, was granted by the sister she just called a disgrace in front of 100 people. The champagne in my glass caught the lantern light, turning golden. I set it down carefully on the white tablecloth and straightened the napkin beside my plate. Jennifer, the young woman in the bow tie, was watching me from near the catering tent. Our eyes met across the garden, and something passed between us. Recognition maybe. Or just the acknowledgement that some people see more than others realize. The speeches were over now. Music started playing, something classical and elegant. People began moving again, conversations resuming, the moment already being repackaged into something more comfortable. Just Victoria being Victoria, someone would say later. You know how she gets when she's excited. My mother appeared at Victoria's side, embracing her, whispering something that made my sister laugh. My father shook Derek's hand again, then clapped him on the shoulder like they were already old friends. They looked perfect together, the 4 of them. A portrait of success and happiness and everything working out exactly as it should. I stood up slowly, smoothing my dress. The teenagers at my table were taking selfies with their champagne flutes. The elderly aunt was asleep, her head tilted back, mouth slightly open. No one noticed me leave the table. I walked along the edge of the garden, staying in the shadows cast by the oak trees. I wasn't leaving. Not yet. I was just moving to a better vantage point. A place where I could see everything that was about to unfold. Because in approximately 7 minutes, Derek Morrison was going to receive a text message from Patricia Voss, asking him to call her immediately regarding an urgent matter with the corporate office. He was going to step away from the party, confused and slightly annoyed, and dial the number. Patricia was going to tell him that the CEO wants to speak with him directly right now about the promotion he just approved for Victoria Pierce. She was going to tell him that there are concerns about potential conflicts of interest that need to be addressed before the promotion can be finalized. She was going to give him my personal cell phone number and instruct him to call within the next 10 minutes. And when he heard my voice on the other end of the line when I introduced myself as N. Pierce, founder and CEO of Pierce Strategic Group, the woman who owns the company he works for, the person who approved every significant decision in his career for the last 3 years, everything was going to change. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I needed them to grovel or apologize or even acknowledge what they'd done, but because I was tired of being invisible. I was tired of watching my accomplishments be erased while Victoria's were celebrated. I was tired of sitting at table 7 behind the bar, with my name spelled wrong and my life dismissed as a cautionary tale. The garden was beautiful in the fading light. The roses smelled sweet. The champagne was excellent. And in 7 minutes, maybe less, the carefully constructed narrative of Victoria Pierce's perfect life was going to crack wide open. And for the first time in 29 years, my family was going to see me exactly as I was. Not the footnote. Not the disappointment. Not the disgrace. Just Natalie Pierce, the woman who'd been building an empire while they were all too busy laughing to notice. I moved through the garden's periphery. Like a ghost, present but unacknowledged. The string quartet had shifted to something more upbeat, and couples were beginning to dance on the temporary floor that had been installed near the pavilion. Victoria and Derek swayed at the center, her head resting on his shoulder, his hand spread across her back. They looked like a cake topper come to life, perfect and pristine and entirely ornamental. My phone buzzed in my clutch. A text from Thomas Reed, my assistant. Everything's set. Patricia will call him at 8:15. Are you sure about this? I typed back quickly. Absolutely. His response came immediately. Then I hope you're ready. Because there's no walking this back. I slipped the phone away and accepted another glass of champagne from a passing waiter, different from Jennifer, older, with the blank professional expression of someone who'd served at 1,000 events exactly like this one. He didn't look at me. I was just another guest, unremarkable, easy to forget. Near the dessert table, my mother held court with a group of her book club friends, women in their 60s with expensive haircuts and tasteful jewelry. They clustered around her like birds at a feeder, heads tilting in synchronized sympathy as she spoke. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew the script by heart. She was talking about Victoria's success, about how proud they were, about how Derek was such a wonderful young man from such a good family. One of the women glanced toward table 7, then leaned in to whisper something. My mother's expression flickered, just for a moment, before resettling into its usual composed arrangement. She was probably explaining my absence from the spotlight. Natalie's going through something right now. She's trying to find herself. You know how it is at that age. As if 29 was still adolescence, still a phase that might eventually resolve into something acceptable. I'd spent so much of my life trying to decode that expression on my mother's face. The one that appeared whenever I entered a room, whenever I spoke at dinner, whenever I existed in a space that required her acknowledgement. It wasn't quite disappointment. Disappointment implied expectation. A hope that had been dashed. What I saw was closer to resignation, like she'd long ago accepted that I was simply less than what she'd ordered, a defective product she was stuck with because the return policy had expired. When I was 7, I won the school spelling bee. I'd studied for weeks, memorizing words I didn't understand, practicing pronunciation until my tongue felt thick with syllables. When they announced my name as the winner, I looked for my mother in the audience. She was there, but she was checking her phone, probably coordinating something for Victoria's dance recital the following weekend. At dinner that night, when I tried to tell them about winning, my father cut me off. That's nice, sweetheart. Victoria, tell us about your audition for the spring ballet. I learned then that my victories were interruptions, brief inconveniences before the conversation returned to its proper subject. The thing about being invisible is that it teaches you to see everything else with perfect clarity. While Victoria was performing for audiences, I was watching from the wings, learning how the machinery worked, understanding that attention was a currency and power was something quieter, something that moved through channels most people never thought to examine. I started reading my father's business journals when I was 12. Not because anyone suggested it, but because they were there, stacked on his desk in the study, and no one was paying enough attention to notice me curled in the leather chair by the window, absorbing articles about market trends and hostile takeovers and the art of due diligence. By 14, I understood how corporations were structured. By 16, I was tracking stock portfolios for practice, creating imaginary investment strategies, learning the language of capital and leverage and return on investment. My parents thought I was doing homework. They never asked what I was actually studying. When I told them I wanted to major in finance at Boston University, my mother looked confused. Wouldn't you rather do something more creative? Something with people? She said it like finance was a lonely basement activity. Something desperate people did when they couldn't handle real human interaction. Victoria was majoring in communications, which my mother described as perfect for her personality. So vibrant, so personable, such a natural leader. I went to Boston University anyway, paid for partially by scholarships they never asked about and partially by a small inheritance from my grandmother that they'd forgotten I'd received. I graduated summa cum laude. They didn't come to the ceremony. There was a conflict with Victoria's sorority formal, and we couldn't be in two places at once, my mother explained on the phone. You understand. I did understand. I understood perfectly. After graduation, I told them I'd found an administrative position at a small firm. They nodded approvingly, relieved I'd found something, anything, that would keep me employed and out of their guest room. What I'd actually done was taken my savings, my grandmother's inheritance, and a small business loan, and started Pierce Strategic Group out of a shared office space in Cambridge. For the first 2 years, I lived in a studio apartment that was really just a room with a hot plate, worked 16-hour days, survived on coffee and takeout, and built something they couldn't see because they never looked. I bought my first company when I was 24. A failing logistics firm in Providence that was underwater and desperate. I restructured it, replaced the leadership, streamlined the operations, and sold it 18 months later for 4 times what I'd paid. The profit from that sale let me buy 2 more companies, then 3, then 5. I developed a pattern. Find struggling firms with good bones, companies that were failing because of poor management or bad timing or simple neglect. Buy them quietly, fix them efficiently, either sell them for profit or keep them as part of a growing portfolio. By the time I was 27, I controlled more assets than my father had accumulated in his entire career. He worked in wealth management, advising rich people how to stay rich, taking his percentage, playing golf with clients who saw him as a friendly service provider. I was building an empire in the shadows, and he had no idea because he'd never asked what I actually did for a living. At family dinners, when the conversation turned to work, Victoria would dominate with stories about client meetings and strategy sessions and office politics. If anyone asked about my job, I'd say something vague about corporate consulting and project management, and they'd nod politely before turning back to Victoria. The truth was too big to fit into their understanding of who I was supposed to be. 3 years ago, I heard through industry contacts that Morrison & Associates was in trouble. They'd overextended, made bad bets on clients who couldn't pay, lost 2 major accounts in the same quarter. They were going to fold within 6 months unless someone intervened. I looked into the firm carefully. Good reputation, strong client relationships in certain sectors, talented staff who were being dragged down by incompetent leadership at the top. The bones were good. The structure could be saved. I made an offer through intermediaries. A complex acquisition buried in enough paperwork that my name never appeared on anything public. The existing leadership was allowed to save face by framing it as a merger with a larger investment group. I replaced the CEO quietly, installed Patricia Voss as the regional director, restructured the debt, and started rebuilding. Within 8 months, the firm was profitable again. Within a year, we'd opened an office in Portland and another in Philadelphia. And 6 months into my ownership, Victoria applied for a junior consultant position. I saw her resume cross my desk, forwarded through the normal hiring channels. Bachelor's degree in communications, 3 years of experience at a marketing agency, references that were solid but not spectacular. She was qualified for the position, nothing more. I could have rejected her application, could have quietly ensured she never got the interview. But that would have been petty, and I don't make business decisions based on personal grievances. I approved her for the interview process and told Patricia to evaluate her fairly, without any indication that we were related. Victoria got the job on her own merits. I'll give her that. She interviewed well, knew how to present herself, had enough competence to do the work. Over the next 3 years she moved up steadily. Not because of nepotism, at least not the kind she would have recognized, but because she was decent at her job and the company was growing. Every promotion she received I reviewed personally. Every raise, every performance evaluation, every assignment to high-profile clients. I saw all of it, approved most of it, occasionally pushed back when she was being elevated beyond her actual capabilities. Last Christmas, when she spent 45 minutes at dinner talking about the major client she'd landed, the account that was going to define her career, I'd been the one who approved that client assignment. I'd reviewed her proposal, noted it was competent but not brilliant, and decided she could handle it. When she succeeded, when she closed the deal and received company-wide recognition, I signed off on her bonus personally. And through all of it, through every success she celebrated and every achievement she used to prove her superiority over me, she never once wondered who was making those decisions. Never questioned why her career was ascending so smoothly at a firm that had nearly collapsed before she joined. She thought it was all her, all talent and drive and refusal to be ordinary. The irony was so perfect it sometimes kept me awake at night. Derek Morrison was a different story. He joined the firm 8 months before Victoria, brought in as part of the restructuring to help rebuild the consulting division. He was good at his job, legitimately talented, the kind of strategic thinker who could see around corners and anticipate client needs. I'd approved his hiring and watched his career with professional interest. When he started dating Victoria, I heard about it through the normal office channels. Inter-office romance declared properly to HR. No conflict of interest since they worked in different divisions. It was handled appropriately, and I had no reason to interfere. I met him once, briefly, at a company-wide meeting where I was introduced as a representative from the corporate office. We shook hands. He smiled politely. I asked him 2 questions about his current client portfolio. He answered professionally. The entire interaction lasted maybe 90 seconds, and then I moved on to the next person. He never knew who I was. Why would he? I was just another face from corporate, forgettable and generic. When he proposed to Victoria 2 months ago, I found out the same way everyone else in the company did, through the announcement they made on social media and the excitement that rippled through the office. I sent a congratulatory email through Patricia, standard corporate acknowledgement of a personal milestone. Victoria probably never saw it, just another generic message from management that she deleted without reading. And now here we were, at their engagement party, with Victoria calling me a disgrace while wearing a promotion I'd approved and a ring purchased with a salary I'd authorized. The champagne in my glass had gone warm. I set it on a small cocktail table near the edge of the garden and checked my phone. 8:12. 3 minutes. Victoria and Derek had stopped dancing and were making rounds, greeting guests, accepting congratulations. They moved through the crowd like royalty at a garden party, gracious and glowing, entirely confident in their place at the center of everything. My father intercepted them near the champagne fountain, probably offering another toast or piece of paternal wisdom. My mother hovered nearby, straightening Victoria's dress, brushing an invisible piece of lint from Derek's shoulder. They looked like a family, the 3 of them, complete, whole, exactly as they'd always been, which is to say, exactly as they'd always been without me. I thought about leaving again. Just walking to my car, driving back to Boston, letting them have their perfect evening undisturbed. I'd done that so many times before, extracted myself quietly from situations where I wasn't wanted, made myself smaller to accommodate their comfort. But something had shifted tonight. Maybe it was the word disgrace, delivered so casually in front of people I'd known my entire life. Maybe it was the misspelling of my name on the seating chart, the wilted centerpiece at table 7, the 3 years of watching Victoria build a pedestal from bricks I'd handed her. Or maybe I was just tired of being the person who absorbed humiliation with grace, who made it easy for them to forget me, who carried the weight of their dismissal without ever setting it down. Jennifer appeared beside me, balancing an empty tray against her hip. She glanced at the crowd, then back at me. "Your sister seems happy," she said quietly. It wasn't a question, just an observation. I nodded. "She usually is." Jennifer hesitated, then spoke again, her voice lower. "I'm graduating next spring. Business management. I've been working events like this to pay for school." She paused. "I see a lot of families. A lot of dynamics." I didn't respond, just waited. "You don't look like someone who belongs at table 7, she said. Then she walked away before I could answer, disappearing into the catering tent with her empty tray. My phone buzzed. 8:14. 1 minute. I watched Derek laugh at something my father said, watched him check his phone briefly, then slip it back into his pocket. He wasn't expecting anything urgent. Why would he be? This was his engagement party. A night of celebration. A moment of pure uncomplicated happiness. I almost felt bad about what was about to happen. Almost. But then I remembered Victoria's toast, the way she'd looked in my direction when she said disgrace, the casual cruelty that came so naturally to her because she'd never faced consequences. I remembered every birthday where I received generic gifts, while she opened carefully chosen presents. Every family photo where I was positioned at the edge or excluded entirely. Every conversation where my accomplishments were met with polite indifference, while hers sparked genuine pride. I remember being 12 years old at that combined birthday and ballet recital, standing in a dress that smelled like mothballs, watching everyone applaud my sister while I held a torn book with a price tag still attached. I remembered my mother telling me to move out of the frame because the lighting was better without me blocking it. Derek's phone rang. I could see it from across the garden, the way he frowned slightly and pulled it from his pocket, checking the screen. His expression shifted from confusion to concern. He said something to Victoria, gesturing at the phone, then stepped away from the crowd, moving toward the quieter section of garden near the rose trellises. Victoria watched him go, her smile faltering slightly, then recovered and turned back to the guests, continuing to work the room. I stayed where I was, partially hidden by the oak tree's shadow, and waited. This was it. The moment where everything I'd built in silence, every decision I'd made in rooms they didn't know existed, every hour I'd spent constructing something real while they were busy constructing narratives, was about to become visible. Not because I needed their validation, not because I wanted their approval, but because I was done being erased. Derek was on the phone now, his posture stiff, his free hand running through his hair. Even from a distance I could read the body language. Confusion giving way to alarm. Giving way to something that looked like panic. He was talking to Patricia, and Patricia was telling him that there were irregularities with Victoria's promotion. Concerns from corporate, potential conflicts of interest that needed immediate resolution. She was telling him that the CEO wanted to speak with him directly right now, and she was giving him my personal number. I watched him end the first call, stare at his phone for a moment, then dial again. My phone rang in my hand. I let it ring twice before answering, keeping my voice professional, neutral, the tone I used in board meetings and acquisition negotiations. This is Natalie Pierce. There was a pause on the other end, the sound of Derek Morrison trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he thought he knew. Miss Pierce, this is Derek Morrison from Morrison & Associates. I was told to call this number regarding an urgent matter about Victoria Pierce's recent promotion. I know who you are, Mr. Morrison. I've been reviewing your file along with hers. There are some concerns we need to address. Another pause, longer this time. I could hear him breathing, processing, trying to understand how this conversation was happening. I'm sorry, he said finally, but I'm at a personal event right now. Could we schedule a time tomorrow to discuss this? I'm afraid it can't wait. We've discovered that you're personally involved with Ms. Pierce, and given that her promotion was approved through channels that ultimately report to my office, there are questions about whether proper protocols were followed. His voice became more strained. I disclosed the relationship to HR. Everything was handled appropriately. I'm sure you believe that, I said calmly, but we need to verify certain details before the promotion can be finalized. And given the nature of tonight's celebration, I thought it was important to address this immediately rather than letting it proceed, based on incomplete information. What celebration? How do you know about tonight? I could hear the confusion turning to something else now, something closer to fear. The garden was still beautiful. The music still played. Victoria was still smiling, still performing her perfect evening, unaware that 20 yards away, her fiancé was beginning to understand that something was very wrong. Mr. Morrison, I said, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel uncomfortable, I make it my business to understand the personal dynamics that might affect my companies. When two employees at a firm I own decide to get engaged, particularly when one of them is celebrating a promotion that crossed my desk for final approval, I pay attention. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, trying to piece together information that didn't fit the narrative he'd been living inside. Your desk, he repeated slowly. I'm sorry, but who exactly are you? I am the founder and CEO of Pierce Strategic Group. We acquired Morrison and Associates 3 years ago through a structured buyout that allowed your previous leadership to exit gracefully. Since then, every major decision at your firm, including your own hiring, your partnership promotion last year, and Victoria Pierce's recent elevation to senior consultant, has ultimately required my approval. I paused, letting that information settle. So when you ask who I am, Mr. Morrison, I'm the person who signs off on your career. His breathing had changed, becoming shallower, faster. I could picture him standing there in his tailored suit, his perfect hair, his expensive watch, trying to reconcile the voice on the phone with whatever he thought he knew about corporate structure and chain of command. This doesn't make sense, he said finally. Pierce Strategic Group. The board reports are always signed by N. Pierce. I've seen them. That's correct. N. Pierce. Natalie Pierce. I've always used my first initial in professional correspondence. It maintains a certain level of privacy that I find useful. But he stopped and I could hear him recalibrating. You're Victoria's sister. The silence that followed was profound. Somewhere in the garden someone laughed. The string quartet moved into a new piece, something light and romantic. The roses continued to smell sweet, and the lanterns continued to glow, and the champagne fountain continued to bubble, but for Derek Morrison, the entire architecture of his understanding was collapsing. I am Victoria's sister, I confirmed, the one who was seated at table 7 behind the bar, with her name spelled incorrectly. The one she referred to in her toast as a disgrace to the family name. The one who, according to the narrative you've presumably heard, lacks ambition and drive and has never accomplished anything worth mentioning. There was no response. I continued, my voice remaining calm, professional, empty of the emotion that would have complicated what I needed to say. I want to be very clear about something, Mr. Morrison. Your relationship with Victoria is not the issue here. You disclosed it appropriately, and there's no structural conflict of interest since you work in different divisions. However, her promotion is the issue because it was approved based on performance metrics that I'm now reviewing more carefully. What does that mean? His voice had an edge now, defensive, protective of the woman he was planning to marry. It means that Victoria has been taking credit for work that wasn't entirely hers. It means that the major client acquisition she's been celebrated for, the one that justified her promotion, was actually a repackaged proposal from another consultant that she presented as her own original strategy. It means that when I review the documentation more carefully, as I've been doing this week, there are inconsistencies that suggest ethical violations. I let that hang in the air between us. That's not true, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. She wouldn't do that. I have the original proposals in front of me right now, I said, which was true. I brought my tablet to the party, loaded with files I've been reviewing all week. I can send them to your personal email if you'd like to compare them yourself. The timestamps, the formatting, the strategic language, it's all there. But more importantly, I have the documentation trail that shows she submitted work that had already been rejected by my office 6 months earlier for lack of originality. She modified it just enough to make it seem different, then took full credit when the client approved. The silence stretched longer this time. I could hear ambient noise in the background, the distant music, someone calling out a greeting. He was still at the party, standing somewhere in the garden where his fiancée was celebrating a promotion that was now crumbling under scrutiny. Why are you telling me this now? He asked finally. Why tonight? Because tonight she called me a disgrace in front of 100 people, I said simply. Because I'm tired of being invisible. Because for 3 years I've watched her build a reputation on work I approved, using resources I provided in a company I own, while treating me like I'm something shameful that needs to be hidden away at the singles table. And because you deserve to know who you're marrying. That last part seemed to hit differently. I heard him exhale, a long slow breath that carried something like recognition or maybe just exhaustion. What happens now? He asked. Now you make a choice, I said. You can go back to the party, say nothing, and let this evening continue as planned. Victoria's promotion will be suspended pending an ethics review, which will take approximately 2 weeks and will likely result in her being reassigned to a different office, probably Portland, where she can rebuild her credibility under closer supervision. Or you can tell her what you've learned, and we can address this directly tonight with transparency. Either way, the outcome is the same. The promotion doesn't stand as is. But how you handle the information is your decision. Why would you give me that choice? He asked. You could just handle this through official channels. Make it clinical and corporate. Because you seem like a decent person, I said, and I don't believe in punishing people for someone else's choices. You didn't know what she was doing. You disclosed your relationship appropriately. You've done your job well. This isn't about you. It's about ensuring that the standards I've established for my companies are maintained, and about making it clear that I'm not someone who can be dismissed without consequences. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, more human. She talks about you sometimes. Victoria says you're lost, that you never figured out what you wanted to do with your life. She says it with pity, like she feels bad for you. I know, I said. She's been saying versions of that for years. Is any of it true? Are you lost? No, Mr. Morrison. I'm not lost. I've just been building something in a direction they never thought to look. Another pause. This is insane, he said, but he didn't sound angry, just bewildered. I've been working at this firm for 3 years, and you're telling me that Victoria's sister, the one who gets seated at the overflow table, is the person who owns everything. That's exactly what I'm telling you. And if you need verification, you can call Patricia Voss right now and ask her to confirm my identity. She'll tell you the same thing. Better yet, you can do a simple corporate records search when you get home tonight. Pierce Strategic Group is a private company, but the ownership structure is on file with the state. You'll find my name on every document that matters. I could hear him moving now, footsteps on gravel or stone, probably walking further away from the party. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more intimate, like he was sharing something he hadn't planned to say. The watch you're wearing. I noticed it when I walked past your table earlier. That's a Patek Philippe Nautilus. Those start at around $80,000. I glanced down at my wrist, at the watch I'd bought myself 3 years ago when Pierce Strategic Group's portfolio crossed $50 million in total assets. It had been an indulgence, a private celebration that no one else would recognize because my family had never learned to see the markers of actual wealth. They saw Victoria's designer handbags and her leased BMW and thought that was success. They missed the quietly expensive things that people with real money wear without announcement. You know your watches, I said. My father collects them, Derek said. Taught me to recognize quality. When I saw yours, I thought it was strange. Someone at the singles table wearing a watch that costs more than most people's cars. I almost said something, but then I figured maybe it was a family heirloom or something. It's not an heirloom, I said. I bought it for myself. With money I earned building companies while my family was busy noticing my sister. He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was the laugh of someone realizing they'd completely misread a situation, that the world was shaped differently than they believed. So what do I do now? He asked. What would you do if you were me? I considered the question carefully. If I were you, I would go back to the party. I would finish the evening with Grace because these are your guests too, and they came to celebrate something they believe is real. Then tomorrow, in the clear light of day, I would sit down with Victoria and ask her about her work. Not accusatory, just curious. Ask her to walk you through the client acquisition process, the original strategy development, the approval chain. See if her story holds up under gentle scrutiny. And then you decide what kind of person you want to build a life with. Someone who takes credit for others' work, or someone who earns their achievements honestly. That's not really a choice, he said quietly. That's you telling me what you think I should do. No, I said. I'm telling you what I would do if I valued integrity. What you actually do is entirely up to you. I'm not interested in controlling your personal life, Mr. Morrison. I'm interested in maintaining ethical standards in my company. Everything else is between you and Victoria. There was a long silence. Then he said something I hadn't expected. I'm sorry. For what? For what she said tonight. The disgrace comment. Even if I didn't know who you were then, I knew it was cruel. I saw your face when she said it. You looked like someone who'd been hearing that kind of thing for a very long time. I felt something shift in my chest. Some small crack in the armor I'd built over years of small cuts and casual dismissals. Thank you, I said simply. I'm going to need time to process this, he said. All of it. The company ownership, the ethics concerns, what it means that my fiancé's sister is the person I've been reporting to indirectly for 3 years. This is a lot. Take the time you need, I said. But Mr. Morrison, one more thing. Don't tell Victoria about this call until you're ready to have the full conversation. If she knows I've intervened, she'll find a way to spin it, to make herself the victim of my jealousy or my bitterness or whatever narrative lets her avoid accountability. Let her think the ethics review is coming from corporate generally, not from me specifically. At least until you've had a chance to look at the evidence yourself. That feels like a game, he said. Like manipulation. It's protection, I corrected. For both of you. If she knows it's me, this becomes about our family dynamics instead of about her professional conduct. It becomes personal instead of procedural. And that doesn't serve anyone. He exhaled again, that same long, slow breath. "Okay," he said. "Okay, I'll look at the documentation you mentioned. If you send it to my personal email, I'll review it tonight after everyone leaves. And I won't say anything to Victoria until I understand what I'm looking at." "Thank you," I said. "And Mr. Morrison, for what it's worth, I hope you find answers that let you move forward with clarity. Whatever that looks like." "Yeah," he said. "Me too." The call ended. I stood there in the shadow of the oak tree holding my phone, feeling the weight of what I just set in motion. There was no going back now. By tomorrow morning, Derek would have seen the evidence. He would understand that the woman he was planning to marry had built her recent success on appropriated work and false credit. He would have to decide whether that was something he could accept, whether love was enough to outweigh ethical compromise, whether the person he thought he knew was real or just another performance. And Victoria would have to face consequences for the first time in her life. Not catastrophic consequences, not the kind that would ruin her, but real ones. A suspended promotion. A transfer to a smaller office. The knowledge that someone had been watching, evaluating, finding her wanting. The knowledge that the sister she'd dismissed as irrelevant was the architect of everything she'd celebrated. I walked back toward the garden, moving slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the brighter light near the pavilion. Derek had returned to the party but was standing alone near the champagne fountain, staring at his phone with an expression that suggested he was barely seeing it. Victoria was with my mother and a group of her friends, laughing at something, her hand gesturing dramatically, probably telling another story about her brilliant career. She hadn't noticed Derek's absence or his return. She was too busy performing. My father approached me as I passed near the dessert table. He held a small plate with a slice of cake, and his cheeks were flushed with wine. "Natalie," he said, as if just remembering I existed. "You're still here. I thought you might have left." I smiled politely. "The party's lovely. I wouldn't want to miss it." He nodded, took a bite of cake, swallowed. "Your sister is doing so well. We're very proud." "I know," I said. "You mention it often." He looked at me more closely, something shifting in his expression, like he was seeing me for the first time that evening and finding it slightly uncomfortable. "You look different tonight," he said. "I can't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it's the dress. Maybe it's that you're actually looking at me," I said quietly. He blinked, uncertain whether I was joking. Then he forced a laugh, clapped me on the shoulder in a way that was probably meant to be affectionate, but felt more like dismissal. "Well, don't sell yourself short. You'll find your path eventually. Just takes some people longer than others." "I already found it," I said. "You just never asked where I was going." He looked confused, opened his mouth to respond, but someone called his name from across the garden and he turned away, already forgetting the conversation, already moving toward something more important. I watched him go, feeling nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just a kind of distant observation, like watching a character in a play whose motivations you understood but could no longer connect with emotionally. Jennifer appeared beside me again, this time carrying a tray of coffee cups. The party was winding down, moving into the later phase where people lingered over dessert and caffeine, not ready to leave but running out of things to say. She tilted her head toward where Derek stood by the fountain. "That man looks like he just got terrible news," she said quietly. I followed her gaze. Derek was still staring at his phone, his jaw tight, his posture rigid. "Maybe he did," I said. Jennifer looked at me, really looked at me, with the kind of direct assessment that most people avoid. "Whatever you did," she said, "I hope it was worth it." I considered the question honestly. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "Ask me tomorrow." She smiled slightly, the kind of smile that suggested she understood more than she was saying. Then she moved on with her tray, leaving me standing alone near the dessert table with a plate I hadn't remembered picking up and a glass of champagne I hadn't remembered accepting. The garden was beautiful in the fading light. the lanterns casting warm shadows across the white linen and the rose gold decorations. The string quartet played something soft and melancholy. Couples swayed on the dance floor. My mother laughed her practiced laugh. Victoria glowed in her white dress, the center of attention, exactly where she'd always been. And I stood at the edge of it all, no longer invisible but not yet seen, waiting for the moment when everything I'd built in silence would finally speak louder than anything they'd ever said about me. Derek's phone rang again. I saw him check the screen, then step away from the crowd, moving back toward the rose trellises. This would be Patricia calling back, probably with additional information I'd asked her to provide. Details about the original consultant whose work Victoria had appropriated, timestamps on when documents had been submitted and rejected, the paper trail that would make it impossible to deny what had happened. He answered, listened, his face growing more serious. Then he ended the call and stood there for a long moment, completely still, like someone who just watched their future reshape itself into something unrecognizable. When he finally moved, it was to approach Victoria. I watched from my position near the dessert table as he touched her elbow, leaned in to speak quietly. She turned to him with a smile that faltered when she saw his expression. They spoke in low voices, too quiet for me to hear, but I could read the body language. His was tense, urgent. Hers was confused, then defensive. She shook her head, said something sharp. He responded, showed her his phone. Her face went pale. My mother noticed the exchange and moved toward them, her maternal instincts sensing distress. Derek held up a hand, a gesture that said not now, and my mother stopped, uncertain, looking between them with an expression that suggested her perfect evening was developing cracks. Victoria's voice rose slightly, not quite loud enough to draw general attention but sharp enough to carry. That's ridiculous. You can't seriously believe that. Derek said something else, still quiet, still controlled. Victoria looked around the garden, her eyes searching, and then they found me, standing by the dessert table holding my champagne, watching. Our eyes met across the distance and I saw the moment she began to put pieces together. The phone call that had pulled Derek away. His strange mood. The accusations about her work. And me, her useless sister, standing there with an expression that probably revealed more than I intended. She started walking toward me. Not running, nothing that dramatic, but moving with purpose, her white dress flowing behind her. Her face set in an expression I recognized from childhood. The expression she wore when she was about to assert dominance, to put me back in my place, to remind me and everyone watching that she was the one who mattered. Derek followed her, reaching for her arm, but she shook him off. My mother called her name, confused. My father looked up from his conversation, sensing something wrong. The music continued, oblivious. Victoria stopped 3 feet from me, close enough that I could see the anger in her eyes, the way her jaw was clenched, the slight tremor in her hands that suggested she was barely holding herself together. What did you do? She asked, her voice low and dangerous. I took a sip of champagne, kept my expression neutral. I don't know what you mean. Don't play games with me, she hissed. Derek just got a call from corporate. They're reviewing my promotion. They're saying there are questions about my work. And somehow, I don't think that's a coincidence. I could have lied. Could have acted surprised, confused, innocent. But I was tired of performing. I set my champagne glass down on the table, folded my hands in front of me, and looked at my sister with absolute clarity. No, I said calmly. It's not a coincidence. Her eyes widened slightly, not quite believing I'd admitted it. You, she said. You did this. On my engagement party. On the night I'm celebrating everything I've worked for. You found a way to ruin it because you're jealous. Jealous, I repeated, and despite everything I felt myself smile. Victoria, I own the company you work for. I have for 3 years. Every promotion you've received, every raise, every client assignment you've celebrated at family dinners, all of it crossed my desk for approval. I'm not jealous of you. I'm the reason you have anything to be jealous about. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother had moved closer, was standing just behind Victoria, her hand pressed to her mouth. My father had stopped mid-conversation, was staring at us with an expression of complete incomprehension. Derek stood slightly to the side, watching, his face unreadable. And Victoria just stood there, her mouth opening and closing, trying to form words that wouldn't come. That's impossible, she finally said. You work some administrative job. You've never done anything significant. You're the one who couldn't figure out her life. I figured out exactly what I wanted, I said quietly. I just didn't need you to know about it. I built Pierce Strategic Group from nothing while you were in college. I acquired Morrison & Associates 3 years ago when it was failing. I restructured it, saved it, made it profitable. And then you applied for a job there and I approved your hire. I've been signing off on your career ever since. Victoria shook her head, backing up a step. No, you're lying. This is some kind of sick joke. Derek, tell her she's lying. But Derek didn't say anything. He just stood there, and his silence was confirmation enough. My mother found her voice finally, thin and strained. Natalie, what is she talking about? What company? I turned to look at her, at this woman who'd spent 29 years finding ways to position me at the edge of family photos, to redirect conversations away from my accomplishments, to treat my presence as something to be managed rather than celebrated. I'm talking about the fact that while you were all busy noticing Victoria, I built something real. Something substantial. Something that actually matters. And I did it quietly because I learned a long time ago that you don't see me anyway. So why bother making noise? My father moved forward, his face red. Now wait just a minute. If you've been running some kind of company, you should have told us. We're your family. Why would I tell you? I asked. So you could explain it away, minimize it, find some way to make it about Victoria? So I could watch you do what you've done my entire life, which is make sure I understand that nothing I accomplish will ever matter as much as anything she does. He opened his mouth to argue, but I continued before he could speak. Last year I bought 3 companies. This year I'm on track to acquire 4 more. My personal net worth is somewhere north of $40 million. I employ over 300 people across 6 states. I've been featured in 2 industry publications under my professional name, and not one of you noticed. Not one of you ever asked what I actually do for work beyond accepting whatever vague answer I gave at family dinners. The numbers seemed to stun them into silence. $40 million. 300 employees. These weren't figures that fit into the narrative they'd constructed. The story of Natalie the disappointment, Natalie the administrative assistant, Natalie who would eventually figure things out if she just tried harder. Victoria found her voice again, but it came out as barely more than a whisper. If this is true, if you actually own Morrison & Associates, then why didn't you just fire me? Why let me work there at all? Because you're competent at your job, I said simply. When you're actually doing your own work instead of taking credit for someone else's. I don't mix personal feelings with business decisions. You got hired on your merits. You got promoted when you earned it. But this last promotion, the one you were celebrating tonight, that one you didn't earn. That one was built on work you stole from another consultant, repackaged and presented as your own. And I can prove it. She looked like I'd slapped her. That's not true, she said. But her voice lacked conviction. The original proposal came through my office 6 months ago, I continued. From a junior consultant named Rebecca Chen. It was innovative, well-researched, exactly the kind of strategic thinking we want to encourage. I rejected it because the timing was wrong for that particular client, but I made a note to reconsider it later. 2 months ago, you submitted almost the exact same proposal, changed just enough to obscure the similarities. You presented it as your own original work. And when the client approved it, you took full credit. Rebecca Chen left the company last month because she felt her contributions weren't being recognized. You didn't just steal her work. You stole her career trajectory. Victoria's face had gone from pale to flushed, red creeping up her neck. I didn't steal anything. I developed that strategy independently. If there are similarities to someone else's work, it's coincidence. I pulled my phone from my clutch, opened the files I'd prepared, turned the screen toward her. These are the original documents, I said. Rebecca's proposal from 6 months ago, complete with timestamps and metadata. And these are yours from 2 months ago. The language is nearly identical in 3 key sections. The strategic framework is the same. Even some of the formatting choices match. This isn't coincidence, Victoria. This is plagiarism. She stared at the screen, her eyes moving over the evidence, and I watched something crumble behind her eyes. Some essential piece of the armor she wore. The certainty that she was special, chosen, destined for greatness. You're doing this because you're bitter, she said finally, but her voice was weak. Because you've always been jealous of me. I shook my head slowly. I'm doing this because you called me a disgrace in front of 100 people, and I decided I was done letting you define me. I'm doing this because for 3 years I've watched you build a reputation on a foundation I provided, and tonight I realized I don't owe you that protection anymore. I'm doing this because you need to understand that actions have consequences, and I'm tired of being the person who absorbs your cruelty without response. Derek stepped forward, his hand on Victoria's shoulder. We should go inside, he said quietly. Talk about this privately. No, Victoria said, shaking him off. No, I want everyone to hear this. I want them to hear how my bitter, jealous sister waited until my engagement party to try to destroy my career, because she can't stand to see me happy. She was looking at the crowd now, at the guests who had been slowly drifting closer, drawn by the confrontation. Her voice rose, taking on the theatrical quality she used when she wanted sympathy. She's lying. She's making all of this up because she's always resented me. Because our parents loved me more, because I was successful and she wasn't, because I have everything she wanted and she can't handle it. I could have argued, could have defended myself, pulled out more evidence, made my case to the assembled witnesses. But I didn't need to. Because at that moment, a voice came from behind me, calm and authoritative and immediately recognizable to everyone who worked at Morrison & Associates. That's not accurate, Miss Pierce, Patricia Voss said, stepping out from where she'd been standing near the catering tent. I'd asked her to come tonight, to be present in case this moment arrived, and she'd agreed. Patricia was in her 50s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of presence that made people sit up straighter when she entered a room. She walked forward until she stood beside me, her expression professional but not unkind. I'm Patricia Voss, she said, addressing the crowd. I'm the regional director at Morrison & Associates. And I can confirm that everything Ms. Natalie Pierce has told you tonight is accurate. She is the founder and CEO of Pierce Strategic Group, the parent company that owns our firm. She has been our ultimate authority for 3 years. And the ethics concerns regarding Victoria Pierce's promotion are legitimate and currently under official review. Victoria's face transformed in stages. First came disbelief, eyes darting between Patricia and me as if trying to find the seam in the reality that was unfolding. Then came a flash of something raw and exposed, vulnerability she rarely showed. Before her features hardened into something brittle and defensive. Patricia stood perfectly still beside me, her presence a wall of credibility that Victoria couldn't scale or dismiss. This was not some family drama that could be reframed through tears and strategic storytelling. This was her boss, someone she'd worked under for 3 years, someone whose approval she'd sought in meetings and performance reviews, confirming that the sister she'd mocked was actually the person who controlled her professional fate. My mother made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob, her hand moving from her mouth to her throat. My father's face had gone slack, his earlier confidence draining away as he processed what Patricia had just said. The guests, sensing they were witnessing something that went beyond typical family tension, had gone completely silent. Even the string quartet had stopped playing, probably at some signal from someone who understood that music was no longer appropriate for whatever this moment had become. The garden felt suspended, caught in that breathless space between what was and what would be, waiting for someone to move or speak or break the spell. Derek was the first to find words. He looked at Victoria with an expression that combined pity and disappointment in equal measure. You knew, he said quietly. When I told you about the call from corporate, when I showed you the concerns they raised, you knew it was legitimate. You knew there was truth to it. Victoria turned to him sharply. I didn't steal anything. That consultant, Rebecca, she must have seen my preliminary notes or overheard conversations or something. Her work was derivative of mine, not the other way around. It was a weak defense and she knew it, desperation leaking through the cracks in her composure. Patricia pulled out her own phone, scrolled briefly, then spoke with the measured tone of someone presenting facts rather than opinions. Miss Chun submitted her proposal on March 14th of last year. The metadata on the document shows it was created over a period of 3 weeks prior to submission. Your proposal, Victoria, was submitted on September 23rd. The metadata on your document shows it was created over 2 days, and several sections contain formatting artifacts that suggest they were copied and pasted from another source. We ran a detailed comparison this afternoon. The similarities are not coincidental. They're too extensive, too specific. You used her work as a template and made surface changes to obscure the connection. The precision of Patricia's statement left no room for alternative interpretation. This wasn't opinion or assumption. This was documented fact, backed by the kind of technical evidence that would hold up in any professional review. Victoria opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I could see her trying to formulate a response that would salvage something, anything, from the wreckage of her celebration. But there was nothing left to salvage. The truth was standing in the garden with all of us, inescapable and damning. My mother finally found her voice, though it came out thin and strained. "Natalie," she said, and I was struck by how rarely she actually said my name with any weight behind it. "Natalie, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you say something about what you were doing?" I turned to look at her fully. This woman who had spent 29 years teaching me through 1,000 small actions that I was less interesting, less valuable, less worthy of attention than my sister. "When would I have told you?" I asked, and my voice was gentle rather than accusatory. "At Thanksgiving, when you spent 2 hours talking about Victoria's promotion and cut me off after 30 seconds when I mentioned a project I was working on. At Christmas, when you forgot to include me in the family photo, until Victoria reminded you. At Easter, when Dad used my LLC without permission to help his nephew, and told me I was being too sensitive when I objected." She flinched at each example, and I watched something shift in her expression. Not quite recognition, not yet, but the beginning of awareness that perhaps the story she'd been telling herself about her 2 daughters was incomplete. "Your sister said you worked in administration," she said weakly. "Some small firm. She said you were comfortable but not ambitious." "I never said that," I replied calmly. "You assumed it. When I told you I was working in corporate consulting and project management, you heard what you wanted to hear. You filled in the gaps with a narrative that made sense to you, one where Victoria was the successful daughter and I was the one still figuring things out. And I let you believe it because correcting you would have required you to actually listen, and you'd made it clear over 3 decades that listening to me wasn't a priority." My father made a dismissive gesture, his discomfort manifesting as irritation. "That's not fair. We've always supported you. Both of you equally." The words were so divorced from reality that I almost laughed. Instead, I pulled out my phone and opened my photo gallery, scrolled back through years of images until I found what I was looking for. I turned the screen toward him. "This is from Victoria's college graduation. There are 43 photos in this album. Victoria appears in 41 of them. I appear in 3, and in 2 of those I'm partially cut off at the edge of the frame." I scrolled further. "This is from her wedding. 78 photos. She's in 76. I'm in 12, and in most of those I'm in the background behind other people barely visible." I looked up at him, at his face that was struggling between defensiveness and something that might have been shame. "This is the visual record of our family, Dad. This is the evidence of how you saw us, how you framed us, literally and figuratively. I'm not making this up or exaggerating. I'm showing you what actually happened, documented in images you took or approved. So when you say you supported us equally, I need you to understand that the evidence doesn't support that claim. Not even close." He looked at the photos, his expression hardening as people's expressions do when confronted with truths they'd rather not acknowledge. "Well," he said, his voice taking on an edge, "maybe if you'd been more present, more engaged with the family, there would have been more photos of you." It was such a perfectly circular piece of logic, such a complete inversion of cause and effect, that I felt something inside me finally release. The last thread of hope that they might understand, that this conversation might lead to recognition or reconciliation or anything resembling repair, snapped cleanly. I wasn't going to convince them. They were going to rewrite this entire evening in their minds until it became a story about my bitterness, my jealousy, my inability to be happy for Victoria's success. They would find a way to make themselves the victims of my cruelty rather than the architects of my invisibility. And I realized, standing there in the garden with the lanterns glowing and the roses smelling sweet, and my sister's engagement party dissolving into wreckage, that I didn't need them to understand. I didn't need their validation or their apology or their sudden recognition of who I actually was. I'd built something real without them. I'd become someone substantial in spaces they never thought to look. And their opinion of me, their version of me, had no power anymore because it was fiction, and fiction dissolves when you stop believing in it. I put my phone away and looked at Victoria, who was standing very still now. her earlier defiance replaced by something that looked like shock. "I'm not trying to destroy you," I said quietly. "I'm trying to hold you accountable. There's a difference. Your promotion is being suspended because you submitted work that wasn't yours. That's a professional ethics violation that would have consequences regardless of our family relationship. You'll be transferred to the Portland office, where you'll work under closer supervision and have the opportunity to rebuild your reputation through legitimate achievements. It's not a firing. It's not a career death sentence. It's a consequence, and if you handle it with integrity, you can recover from it." She looked at me with eyes that were bright with unshed tears, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of shame or anger, or just the overwhelm of having her perfect evening dismantled so thoroughly. "You're enjoying this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "After all these years of being nothing, you finally found a way to matter, and you're using it to hurt me." I shook my head slowly. "If I wanted to hurt you, Victoria, I would have fired you 3 years ago when you first applied. I would have ensured you never got hired in the first place. But I didn't do that because I don't make business decisions based on personal grudges. I approved your hire because you were qualified. I approved your promotions when you earned them legitimately. And I'm suspending this promotion because you didn't earn it legitimately. The only person who hurt you tonight is you, through the choices you made about whose work to claim as your own." Derek stepped closer to Victoria, his hand reaching for hers, but she pulled away from him. "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't touch me right now. Everyone is staring at me like I'm some kind of criminal, and you're just standing there letting it happen." He looked pained but didn't reach for her again. "Victoria," he said gently, "you need to step back from this moment and think about what you're being told. Not about your sister or your family or any of that. About the work. About what you submitted. If there's truth to what they're saying, if you did use someone else's proposal without credit, that's something you need to acknowledge and address." "I didn't," she insisted, but her voice had lost its conviction. "I wouldn't do that." Patricia spoke again, her tone professional but not unkind. "Miss Pierce, I've worked in this industry for 26 years. I've seen this situation before and I know how it happens. Someone is under pressure to perform, to prove themselves, to meet expectations. They come across work that's strong, work that could solve their problem, and they convince themselves that borrowing from it isn't really stealing. That making changes makes it original. That no one will notice or care. But it is stealing, and people do notice, and it does matter. The question now is how you respond. You can continue denying it, which will only make the review process more difficult and damage your credibility further. Or you can acknowledge what happened, take responsibility, and work to rebuild trust. The path forward exists, but only if you're willing to be honest about how you got here." Victoria stood very still for a long moment, and I watched something move across her face. A series of calculations, perhaps weighing her options, considering the evidence stacked against her. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and tight. "I looked at her work," she said, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. "Rebecca's proposal came across my desk when I was reviewing junior consultant submissions, and I thought it was strong. Really strong. And I was struggling with my own strategy for that client, couldn't quite get it to come together the way I wanted. So I looked at hers more carefully, studied it, and I told myself I was just using it as inspiration, as a framework to help organize my own thinking. But somewhere in that process, the line between inspiration and appropriation got blurred. And I convinced myself it was fine because I changed things, because I added my own elements, because I needed a win. It wasn't a full confession, not quite an acknowledgement of intentional theft, but it was closer to truth than anything else she'd said all evening." Patricia nodded slightly, as if recognizing this as progress. "That's a start," she said. "The review process will examine the details more thoroughly, and there will be consequences, as Ms. Pierce indicated. But acknowledging the problem is the first step toward addressing it." Victoria looked at Derek, and I saw vulnerability in her expression that was uncommon for her. The mask of perfection finally cracking enough to show the person underneath. "I'm sorry," she said to him. "I should have told you when you asked about the call. I should have been honest about what I'd done. I was just scared. Scared of losing the promotion, losing your respect, losing everything I'd worked for." He looked at her for a long moment, and I couldn't read his expression. Then he said quietly, "We'll talk about this later. Privately. Right now, I think we need to end this party and let everyone go home." It was a reasonable suggestion, a way to contain the damage and give everyone space to process what had just happened. But my mother seemed to interpret it as an opportunity to reassert control over the narrative. She moved forward, her hands clasped together, her voice taking on the soothing tone she used when trying to smooth over awkwardness at social gatherings. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said to the assembled guests, who were still watching with the transfixed attention of people witnessing a car accident. Family tensions can run high during celebrations, and sometimes things get said in the heat of the moment that don't reflect reality. "I'm sure we can all sit down tomorrow and work this out rationally." I felt a surge of exhaustion looking at her, at this woman who was already trying to repackage the evening into something manageable, something that wouldn't require her to fundamentally reconsider how she'd understood her daughters or her role in shaping our relationship. "No," I said, my voice cutting through her attempt at damage control. "There's no misunderstanding, Mom. There's just information you didn't have because you never asked. I own a company. Victoria plagiarized work from another employee. These are facts, not heat-of-the-moment exaggerations. And they don't become less true because acknowledging them is uncomfortable for you." She looked at me with something like hurt in her eyes, but I couldn't tell if she was hurt by what I'd said or hurt that I'd said it in front of witnesses, making it impossible for her to maintain her preferred version of reality. "Natalie," she said, and her voice had a pleading quality I'd rarely heard. "Why are you doing this? Why now? Why here?" "Because she called me a disgrace," I said simply. "In front of everyone we know, she made a toast that positioned me as a failure, as someone whose life was so small and sad that I served as a cautionary tale about what happens when you lack ambition. And I decided I was done accepting that characterization. Done letting you all define me by your assumptions rather than my achievements. Done being invisible while Victoria gets celebrated for work I approved. So yes, Mom, I'm doing this now, here in front of everyone because this is where the humiliation happened and this is where the truth needs to be told." The garden was completely silent now. Even the ambient sounds seemed muted, as if the night itself was holding its breath. My father made one more attempt at reasserting paternal authority, his voice taking on the stern tone he used when he wanted to end arguments through sheer force of disapproval. "That's enough," he said firmly. "Both of you. This is inappropriate, and we're not going to continue airing family business in front of guests. Victoria, Derek, I think you should go inside and collect yourselves. Natalie, perhaps you should leave. We can discuss this privately another time." I looked at him, this man who had spent my entire life teaching me through action and inaction that my presence was negotiable, that my feelings were less important than maintaining surface harmony, that the comfort of others took precedence over my own dignity. And I felt the last remaining thread of obligation to his authority snap cleanly. "I'm going to leave," I said calmly. "Not because you told me to, but because I'm done here. I came to celebrate Victoria's engagement because despite everything, she's my sister and I wanted to honor that. I brought a thoughtful gift. I sat quietly at the table you assigned me. I absorbed the public insult with grace. And then when pushed far enough, I responded with truth. I don't owe you more politeness than that." I turned to Patricia, who had remained a steady presence beside me throughout the confrontation. "Thank you for coming tonight," I said. "I know it was an unusual request." She nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I'll handle the follow-up from here," she said. "You should take care of yourself." Then I looked at Derek, who was standing slightly apart from Victoria now, his expression troubled. "I'm sorry your engagement party became this," I said sincerely. "You didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of family dysfunction. I hope you find clarity about what you want moving forward." He met my eyes and nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement if not quite understanding. Finally I looked at Victoria. She was staring at the ground, her shoulders hunched, her earlier confidence completely deflated. I didn't hate her in that moment. I didn't feel triumph or satisfaction or any of the emotions people probably expected. I just felt tired and sad and strangely free. "I hope you learned something from this," I said quietly. "Not about me but about yourself. About the difference between appearing successful and actually earning it. About what it costs to build a reputation on borrowed accomplishments. You're talented enough to do good work on your own. You don't need to take credit for others' efforts. But you have to decide if you're willing to do the harder thing, the honest thing, even when it means advancing more slowly." She didn't respond, didn't look up, and I didn't wait for her to. I turned and walked toward the garden gate, moving through the silent crowd that parted to let me pass. I could feel their eyes on me, could imagine the conversations that would happen the moment I was gone, the stories that would be told and retold, shaped and reshaped until they fit whatever narrative each person needed. Some would see me as vindictive, unable to let my sister have her moment. Others might recognize it as accountability finally arriving after years of imbalance. Most would probably land somewhere in the middle, uncomfortable with the messiness of it all, wishing it had been handled differently, more privately, more politely. As I reached the gate, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to find Jennifer, the young server in the bow tie, slightly out of breath from hurrying to catch up. She held out a small paper napkin with something written on it. Her name and phone number, I realized, looking down at the careful handwriting. I just wanted to say, she said quickly, that what you did took courage. Standing up for yourself when everyone wants you to stay quiet. That's not easy. And the scholarship program you run, the one that helped me get through school, it changed my life. So thank you. Not just for tonight, but for seeing people who needed to be seen. I felt something tighten in my throat. Emotion I'd been holding back throughout the confrontation suddenly threatening to spill over. Thank you, I managed. That means more than you know. She smiled, squeezed my hand briefly, then hurried back toward the catering tent. I stood there for a moment, looking at the napkin in my hand, this small piece of evidence that the work I'd done in silence had mattered to someone, had created ripples I'd never seen but that existed nonetheless. Then I folded it carefully and slipped it into my clutch beside the other artifacts of the evening. I walked to my car, parked 3 blocks away because I hadn't been important enough for the circular driveway. The street was quiet, lined with old oaks whose branches formed a canopy overhead. My heels clicked on the sidewalk, the only sound in the stillness. When I reached my car, a sleek Audi I bought last year without mentioning it to anyone in my family, I stood beside it for a moment, looking back toward the house. I could see the glow of the lanterns above the fence line, could hear the faint murmur of voices as the party presumably disbanded into smaller conversations about what they'd just witnessed. I got in the car, started the engine, and pulled away from Ashford Hills. Away from the garden and the roses and the champagne fountain. Away from my parents and their carefully curated version of family harmony. Away from Victoria and her crumbling pedestal. Away from all of it. The drive back to Boston took an hour, and I spent most of it in silence, processing the evening in fragments. The moment Victoria's face had changed when Patricia confirmed my identity. The way Derek had looked at her when he understood what she'd done. My mother's attempt to smooth everything over with social niceties. My father's insistence that I leave because my truth was too inconvenient for his comfort. When I finally pulled into the parking garage beneath my apartment building, it was nearly 11. I rode the elevator to the 14th floor, unlocked my door, and stepped into the space I'd created for myself. Clean lines, minimalist design, everything chosen deliberately rather than inherited or suggested by people who thought they knew better. I poured myself a glass of wine from a bottle I'd been saving, kicked off my heels, and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the Boston skyline. The city glittered beneath me, thousands of windows lit with other people's lives, other people's struggles and triumphs and ordinary evenings. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. Saw the preliminary reports from Patricia. Are you okay? I typed back, I'm fine. Tired but fine. His response came quickly. You did the right thing. Sometimes the truth needs to be uncomfortable before it can be useful. I set the phone down and took a sip of wine. Did I do the right thing? I'd exposed my sister's plagiarism at her engagement party. I'd revealed my hidden success in the most public way possible. I'd forced my family to confront truths they'd spent 3 decades avoiding. Some people would call that justice. Others would call it revenge dressed up in professional language. Maybe it was both. Maybe the line between holding someone accountable and punishing them was blurrier than I wanted to admit. But what I knew for certain was that I was done being invisible. Done accepting the role they'd assigned me, the script they'd written where I was always secondary, always less, always the footnote to Victoria's headline. I'd spent 29 years building something real while they were busy noticing her, and tonight I'd finally made them see it. Whether they could accept what they'd seen, whether it would change anything about our relationship, those were questions I couldn't answer. But I'd told the truth. I'd stood in the garden with champagne and roses and undeniable evidence, And I'd said this is who I actually am. This is what I've actually done. And you don't get to define me by your assumptions anymore. The next morning, I woke to 17 missed calls and 34 text messages. Most were from numbers I didn't recognize, probably guests from the party reaching out with questions or concern or gossip disguised as worry. A few were from extended family members who'd heard about the confrontation secondhand. 3 were from my mother, each one more desperate than the last. We need to talk. Please call me. Natalie, this is important. I deleted them without responding. I wasn't ready for whatever conversation she wanted to have. Wasn't interested in being convinced that I'd overreacted or been too harsh or should have handled things differently. There was one message from Victoria, sent at 3 in the morning. I hate you. I don't know if that's what you wanted, but it's what you got. I stared at that message for a long time, feeling the weight of it, the finality. Maybe she did hate me now. Maybe she always had, underneath the dismissiveness and casual cruelty, and this had just brought it to the surface. Or maybe she was just scared and hurt, and lashing out at the person who'd shattered her carefully constructed image. Either way, her hatred wasn't something I could fix or avoid. It was just the cost of refusing to stay invisible, and I decided I was willing to pay it. I got dressed, made coffee, and went into the office. Monday morning, back to the work that actually defined me, the companies I'd built, the people I employed, the decisions that had real consequences beyond family drama. Thomas was already at his desk when I arrived, 2 files laid out and an espresso waiting for me. You're a saint, I said, picking up the cup. He smiled slightly. I'm efficient. There's a difference. Also, Patricia called. The formal ethics review begins tomorrow. Victoria's been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. The Portland transfer is confirmed regardless of the review results. She'll start there in 3 weeks. I nodded, taking in the information. And Derek? Thomas consulted his notes. He's requested a meeting with you directly. Says he wants to understand the full scope of the situation before making any personal decisions. He's professional about it, not angry, just wants clarity. I'll meet with him, I said. Schedule it for later this week. Give him time to process everything without the pressure of immediate decisions. Thomas made a note, then looked up at me with an expression that was both concerned and curious. How are you doing? Really? I considered the question honestly. I'm okay, I said. It was brutal and it's going to be complicated for a while, but I'm okay. I spent so much of my life waiting for them to see me, to recognize what I was building, to acknowledge that I mattered. And last night I realized I don't need them to see me anymore. I see myself. I know what I've accomplished. And the people whose opinions actually matter, the colleagues and employees and people I've helped along the way, they see me too. My family's blindness is their loss, not my deficit. He nodded slowly. That's remarkably healthy, actually. Most people in your position would be spiraling. I shrug. Maybe I'll spiral later. Right now I have work to do. And that work felt like solid ground beneath my feet, something real and substantial that existed. Independently of family approval or validation. The week passed in a blur of meetings and decisions and normal professional challenges that had nothing to do with engagement parties or plagiarism or confrontations in roselit gardens. I met with Derek on Thursday afternoon in my office, a space he'd never seen before, probably never imagined. He arrived precisely on time, dressed in a suit, looking tired but composed. Thank you for seeing me, he said as he sat down across from my desk. I know this is an unusual situation. I appreciate you making time. I gestured for him to continue, curious what he'd come to say. I've spent the last few days reviewing everything, he began. The documentation Patricia provided, the timeline, the evidence of plagiarism. And I've talked to Victoria at length about what happened, why it happened, how she justified it to herself. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I believe she made a significant error in judgment. I also believe she's capable of learning from it and doing better. But right now, she's not in a place where she can acknowledge that fully. She's too defensive, too focused on feeling victimized by the consequences to take real responsibility for the choices that led here. I listened without interrupting, letting him work through whatever he'd come to say. I don't know what's going to happen with our engagement, he continued. That's something we need to work through on our own. But professionally, I wanted you to know that I understand why you intervened. Not just because of the family dynamics, though I'm sure that played a role, but because ethical standards matter. If Victoria had gotten away with this, if she'd been promoted based on appropriated work, it would have set a terrible precedent. And other people like Rebecca Chun would have continued being invisible while people like Victoria got celebrated for work they didn't do. He met my eyes directly. So thank you for having the integrity to address it even though it was complicated by your personal relationship. And I'm sorry for what you've endured in your family. I saw enough at that party to understand that the dynamics are deeply unfair, and have been for a long time. I felt something release in my chest, some tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. Thank you, I said quietly. That means more than you probably know. Most people want to focus on how I handled it rather than why it needed handling. He nodded. I think you handled it the only way you could. Sometimes the truth is messy and uncomfortable and ruins parties. But it's still the truth and it still matters. We talked for another 20 minutes about the transition plan for Victoria, about the Portland office and what her role there would look like, about how to maintain professional boundaries while working through personal complications. When he left, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, respect for him, and hope that he would find clarity about what kind of partnership he wanted to build and whether Victoria was capable of being that partner. The following week brought more fallout, expected and manageable. My mother left voicemails that oscillated between pleading and accusatory. My father sent a formal email requesting a family meeting to discuss what had happened, as if this was a business problem that could be resolved through proper process. Extended family members reached out with concern that felt more like curiosity, wanting details about the confrontation they'd missed or heard about secondhand. I responded to none of it, not out of spite, but out of simple self-preservation. I wasn't ready to subject myself to conversations where they would try to convince me I'd overreacted, where they would center their own discomfort rather than acknowledge the decades of dismissal that had led to that moment. Maybe eventually we would talk, would find some new equilibrium in our relationship. But that conversation would happen on my terms when I was ready, if I decided it was worth the emotional energy. For now, I focused on the work that had always been my foundation. Finalized the acquisition of a medical supply company in Rhode Island. I promoted 2 senior managers who'd been doing excellent work without sufficient recognition. I established a new scholarship program specifically for women in business school, who came from families that didn't understand or support their ambitions. That last one felt personal in a way I didn't try to hide. Jennifer, the young server from the party, called me 3 weeks later. I hope it's okay that I'm reaching out, she said. I just wanted to tell you that I got the internship I applied for. The one at the financial firm in New York. They said my interview was strong, and I think it's because I felt confident in a way I haven't before. Watching you stand up for yourself at that party, seeing that success doesn't mean being quiet or accommodating or accepting how other people define you, it changed something for me. I don't know if that makes sense. It makes perfect sense, I told her. And congratulations. You earned that internship through your own merit. I just hope I provided a useful example that you didn't have to shrink yourself to succeed. After we hung up, I sat at my desk looking out at the Boston skyline and thought about legacy, about what we build that lasts beyond quarterly reports and acquisition deals. I'd created companies and generated wealth and employed hundreds of people, and those were real accomplishments that mattered. But maybe the more important thing I'd done was refuse to accept invisibility as my permanent condition. Maybe the real legacy was showing people like Jennifer that you could build something substantial, even when your family didn't believe you were capable of it. That you could succeed on your own terms, even when those terms didn't match what others expected. That being overlooked wasn't the same as being worthless, and sometimes the people closest to you were the last ones to see who you actually were. Victoria started her new position in Portland in early November. I received brief updates from Patricia about her transition, how she was adjusting to the smaller office and more structured supervision. By all accounts, she was doing adequate work. Nothing spectacular but nothing problematic either. She'd lost the gloss of rising star status, but she still had a job and an opportunity to rebuild if she chose to take it seriously. Derek ended their engagement in late November. He told me about it during a brief phone call, his voice sad but certain. I couldn't get past it, he explained. Not the plagiarism itself, though that mattered, but her inability to take real responsibility for it. Every conversation we had, she found a way to make herself the victim. To blame you for being vindictive, or the company for being too harsh, or Rebecca Chun for leaving her work where Victoria could find it. She never just said I made a serious mistake and I need to do better. And I realized I couldn't build a life with someone who can't be accountable. I told him I was sorry it had ended that way, and I meant it. Not sorry that he'd made the choice, but sorry that he'd had to make it, that the person he'd planned a future with had turned out to be someone different than he'd believed. These things happen, he said philosophically. Better to learn it now than 5 years into a marriage. And at least I know I made the right call about the ethics review. That mattered regardless of how the personal relationship worked out. After that call, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief that accountability had held, that bad behavior had faced consequences. Sadness for the relationship that had collapsed under the weight of choices Victoria made. And underneath it all, a persistent ache for the sister relationship we'd never had. The one where we supported each other instead of competing. Where my success could coexist with hers without either of us needing to diminish the other. Christmas approached with its usual complicated logistics. My mother sent a formal invitation to the family gathering, identical to every previous year except for a small handwritten note at the bottom. Please come. We miss you. I stared at that note for a long time, trying to decide what missing me actually meant to them. Missing having the family look complete in photos? Missing having someone to seat at table 7? Or genuinely missing me, the person I actually was rather than the role they'd assigned me? I decided not to go. Not out of punishment or spite, but out of simple self-protection. I wasn't ready to sit through a holiday dinner where they would probably try to smooth everything over with forced normalcy, where they would expect me to accept surface reconciliation without any deeper acknowledgement of what had been broken for so long. Instead, I spent Christmas with Thomas and his family, people who saw me clearly and valued me genuinely, who asked about my work because they were actually interested rather than just being polite. We ate too much food and played board games and laughed without any undercurrent of tension or performance. It was ordinary and peaceful and exactly what I needed. On Christmas evening, Victoria sent me a text. Just one line. I'm sorry for what I said at the party. I stared at that message for a long time, trying to determine if it was genuine or strategic. Whether she meant she was sorry for the words or sorry for the consequences those words had triggered. Eventually I typed back, thank you. I appreciate you saying that. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. A door left slightly open rather than slammed shut. Maybe someday we would talk more deeply, would try to build something new from the rubble of what had broken. Or maybe this was as close as we would get, polite distance instead of hostile dismissal. Either way, I was okay. I had built a life that wasn't contingent on their approval. I had created meaning and success and impact that existed independently of whether they ever recognized it. I was no longer the invisible daughter, the footnote, the disgrace. I was Natalie Pierce, founder and CEO, builder of companies and opportunities. Someone who mattered because I decided I mattered, and then proved it through action. The garden party felt like a lifetime ago and also like yesterday. The memory of standing in the shadows while Victoria toasted herself would probably always sting a little. Always remind me of how much time I'd spent accepting treatment I didn't deserve. But it also marked the moment I'd stopped accepting it. The moment I'd chosen truth over comfort, visibility over peace. And if I had to do it again, standing in that rose-lit garden with champagne and witnesses and the whole careful architecture of their denial crumbling around us, I would make the same choice. Because some truths are worth the mess they create. Some silences need to be broken even when breaking them is loud and uncomfortable and ruins parties. And some people spend their whole lives waiting to be seen, not understanding that sometimes you have to show yourself. Even when the people watching wish you'd stayed hidden. I'd shown myself. Finally, fully, without apology or accommodation. And whatever came next, I would face it as the person I actually was rather than the person they'd needed me to be. That felt like freedom. Complicated, messy, imperfect freedom, but freedom nonetheless. I stood at my office window on a cold January morning, watching snow fall over Boston in thick, lazy flakes that transformed the city into something softer, quieter. 3 months had passed since the engagement party. 3 months of rebuilding routines and redefining what family meant when the traditional structures had proven inadequate. My phone sat on the desk behind me, silent for once. No urgent messages or crisis management required. Just the peaceful rhythm of a business running smoothly because I built it to function that way. Thomas knocked softly before entering, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a folder I recognized as the quarterly reports. He set one cup beside me and opened the folder, pointing to a specific line item. The Portland office exceeded projections by 18%, he said. Victoria's division contributed solid numbers. Not spectacular but consistent and honest. I nodded, taking in the information without the complicated emotions that might have accompanied it months earlier. She was doing her job competently, building a reputation based on actual work rather than borrowed achievements. That was all I'd wanted, really. Not her failure, just her accountability. There was something else, Thomas said, his tone shifting slightly. Rebecca Chun reached out through HR. She heard about the ethics review and wanted to express gratitude. She's at a new firm now doing well, and she said knowing that her work was recognized even retroactively helped her trust her own capabilities again. That meant something, I said quietly. More than Victoria's apology, more than my family's eventual awkward attempts at reconciliation, more than any of the surface gestures that had followed the confrontation. Rebecca Chun had been made invisible by someone else's appropriation, and the correction of that record, the acknowledgement that her work had value and had been stolen, had given her back something essential. That was worth the mess of the garden party. Worth the ruined celebration and the family fractures and all of it. Thomas left me with the reports and my coffee, understanding without being told that I needed a moment alone with my thoughts. I turned back to the window, watching people navigate the snowy sidewalks below, each of them carrying their own complicated stories, their own invisible struggles and private triumphs. How many of them had families that didn't see them clearly? How many had spent years building something real while the people closest to them looked right through their accomplishments? How many had reached a breaking point where silence became more costly than speaking? My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It took me a moment to place the name attached to it, then I remembered. My cousin Maura, the one who'd been at the engagement party, who I'd noticed on her phone immediately after Patricia confirmed my identity. Her message was brief but surprising. I've been thinking about what happened at Victoria's party. About how none of us really knew what you were doing with your life because we never asked. I'm sorry for that. I'm working on asking better questions with my own kids, making sure they know I'm interested in who they actually are, not just who I expect them to be. Thank you for that lesson, even though I'm sure teaching us wasn't your goal. I read the message 3 times, feeling something unexpected. Not quite forgiveness, but maybe the beginning of understanding that some people were capable of growth, of taking an uncomfortable moment and extracting something useful from it. I typed back a simple response. That means a lot. Thank you for telling me. The conversation didn't go further than that, but it didn't need to. It was a small bridge built across a gap that had seemed uncrossable 3 months ago. Evidence that sometimes rupture created space for something different to grow, even if it looked nothing like what had been there before. February brought my 30th birthday, a milestone I once imagined celebrating with family, back when I still believed that achievement would eventually earn their attention. Instead, I spent it with colleagues and friends who'd become my chosen family, people who knew me not as the disappointing daughter or the invisible sister, but as Natalie, the woman who'd built something substantial from nothing and refused to shrink herself for anyone's comfort. We had dinner at a restaurant I'd wanted to try, drank wine that was excellent without being pretentious, laughed about office politics and industry gossip and plans for future acquisitions. No one mentioned Victoria or the engagement party or family drama unless I brought it up, which I didn't. This evening was about presence, not absence, about celebrating who I'd become rather than mourning relationships that had never been what I needed them to be. Jennifer was there, the young server from the party, who'd since become someone I mentored informally, meeting for coffee every few weeks to talk about her career trajectory and the challenges of navigating professional spaces that weren't always designed for women like us. She brought a small gift, wrapped carefully in paper she'd clearly chosen with thought. Inside was a leather-bound journal with my initials embossed on the cover. For writing the next chapter, the card said, "Whatever that looks like." I felt my throat tighten with emotion I usually kept carefully controlled. "Thank you," I managed. "This is perfect." She smiled, squeezed my hand across the table. "You showed me that success doesn't require permission from people who can't see your value. That's worth more than any scholarship or job reference. That's the thing that changes everything." Later that night, alone in my apartment with the city lights sprawling below and the journal sitting on my coffee table, I thought about chapters and narratives and who gets to write the story. For so long, my family had written my story for me, casting me as the sister who couldn't quite measure up, the daughter who needed guidance to find her way, the disappointing one who served as counterpoint to Victoria's shine. And I'd let them write that story because fighting it seemed exhausting, because proving them wrong felt like seeking validation I shouldn't need, because part of me had believed that if I just accomplished enough, they would eventually revise their narrative without me having to force the issue. The engagement party had been the moment I took the pen back, not gently or politely but definitively. I'd rewritten the story in real time, in front of witnesses, with evidence they couldn't dismiss or reframe. And yes, it had been messy. Yes, it had caused pain and fractures and complications that would take years to fully resolve if they ever did. But it had also been true, and sometimes truth mattered more than comfort, more than surface harmony, more than maintaining fictions that made other people feel better about their own choices. I opened the journal Jennifer had given me, and wrote a single sentence on the first page. I am the author of my own story, and I refused to let anyone else hold the pen. It felt like a declaration, a promise to myself that whatever came next, however my family relationships evolved or didn't, I would continue defining myself on my own terms, building meaning through my own efforts, refusing to accept invisibility as my permanent condition. The pen felt solid in my hand, real and weighted with possibility. March brought an unexpected letter. Actual paper in an envelope with handwriting I recognized as my mother's. I almost didn't open it, almost threw it away unopened because I wasn't sure I had the energy for whatever it contained. But curiosity won, or maybe just the faint hope that surprised me with its persistence, the hope that maybe this time would be different. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten carefully as if she drafted it multiple times before committing to final words. She wrote about the engagement party, about watching the confrontation unfold and feeling like she was seeing me clearly for the first time in decades. She wrote about going back through old photo albums and realizing with shame how few pictures included me, how many milestones of mine had been overshadowed or forgotten entirely. She wrote about conversations with my father where they tried to understand how they'd gotten it so wrong for so long, how they'd let their pride in Victoria's conventional success blind them to my quieter but ultimately more substantial achievements. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness, the letter said near the end. I don't think I deserve that yet, maybe not ever. I'm writing to tell you that I see you now. I see what you built while we were busy not noticing. I see the companies and the jobs you created and the people you've helped. I see that you became someone extraordinary not because of our support but despite our neglect. And I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry for every time I made you feel invisible, for every moment I chose Victoria's comfort over your dignity, for every year I let pass without asking what you were actually doing with your brilliant, capable life. You deserved better from me. You deserved better from all of us. The letter sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I responded. I wanted to sit with it, to let the words settle and see if they felt genuine or just strategic. Another attempt to smooth things over without fundamentally changing anything. But the more I read it, the more I felt something shift, not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but maybe the beginning of a path toward it. On the 4th day I wrote back. Not 3 pages, just one, but honest in a way I'd rarely been with her. Thank you for seeing me, I wrote. It doesn't erase the past, doesn't undo the years of feeling invisible in my own family. But it matters that you're trying to understand rather than just defending or explaining away. I'm not ready for family dinners or holidays together yet. I need more time and probably more conversations before we can rebuild anything resembling a normal relationship. But I'm willing to try slowly, if you're willing to keep doing the work of actually seeing who I am rather than who you expected me to be. I mailed the letter and felt lighter somehow, not because I'd forgiven everything but because I'd left the door open to possibility without abandoning my own boundaries and needs. That felt like growth, like the kind of maturity that came from understanding you could hold 2 truths simultaneously. I could acknowledge that my parents had failed me in significant ways, and also recognize that people were capable of change if they chose to do the difficult work of self-examination. Whether they would actually do that work remained to be seen, but at least now there was a conversation happening, words being exchanged that went deeper than surface pleasantries. April brought news that Victoria had been offered a permanent position at the Portland office, no longer on probationary status but fully integrated into the team. Patricia called to inform me, her tone neutral but with an undercurrent of approval. She's done solid work these past months, Patricia said. Stayed late to help junior consultants. took responsibility when projects didn't go perfectly, stopped taking credit for collaborative efforts. I think the transfer was good for her, actually. Removed her from the environment where she built a reputation on shortcuts and gave her space to rebuild based on actual merit. That's all I wanted, I said, and realized it was true. I'd never wanted Victoria to fail catastrophically. Never wanted to destroy her career or her life. I just wanted her to be held to the same standards as everyone else, to face consequences when she cut ethical corners, to understand that success built on appropriation was hollow and unsustainable. Does she know I'm the one who owns the company? I asked. Patricia was quiet for a moment. She knows, she said finally. I told her about a month ago during a performance review. She needed to understand the full context of why the ethics review happened when it did and how it did. Her response was complicated. Anger, shame, something that might have been grudging respect underneath it all. She asked if you'd been watching her work specifically, if every decision she made was being scrutinized by you personally. I told her no, that you review high-level operations but you're not micromanaging individual consultants. That seemed to help, knowing you weren't hovering over her shoulder waiting for her to fail. Good, I said. I don't want to be a presence in her daily work life. I just want the standards maintained. If she's meeting them, then she should be treated like any other employee who's doing their job competently. That's exactly how we're handling it, Patricia confirmed. And for what it's worth, I think this situation, as messy as it was, has probably made both of you better in the long run. You for finally standing up for yourself, her for finally facing real accountability. Sometimes growth requires rupture first. I thought about that after we hung up, about rupture and growth in the relationship between breaking and building. The engagement party had been a rupture, no question. A violent tearing of the careful fabric my family had woven to hide uncomfortable truths. But maybe Patricia was right. Maybe some structures needed to be torn down completely before anything healthier could be constructed in their place. By the time summer arrived, I'd settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable rather than reactive. Work continued to be fulfilling and challenging in equal measure. My relationship with my parents had evolved into something cautious but real, monthly phone calls where we talked about substantive things rather than just surface updates, where they asked actual questions about my business decisions and I answered honestly rather than vaguely. It wasn't the close relationship some families had, probably never would be, but it was authentic in a way our previous dynamic had never been. And authenticity, I'd learned, mattered more than closeness built on false premises. Victoria and I hadn't spoken directly since the engagement party, communicated only through brief, polite text messages on birthdays and holidays. Neither of us seemed ready for more than that, and I was okay with the distance. Maybe someday we would sit down and have a real conversation about what had happened, about the years of imbalance and the night everything broke open and what kind of relationship we wanted moving forward. Or maybe we wouldn't. Maybe we would remain sisters in name only, connected by biology and history, but not by genuine understanding or affection. That would be sad, but it would also be honest, and I'd reached a point where I valued honesty over comfortable fictions. What surprised me most as months passed was how little I thought about the engagement party once the immediate aftermath settled. It had felt so enormous in the moment, so definitive and world-changing, but it turned out to be just one evening in a much longer story. The real work hadn't been the confrontation itself, but everything that came after, the daily choices to maintain boundaries, to keep building the life I wanted regardless of whether my family approved, to refuse to shrink back into invisibility just because visibility had caused discomfort. That work was ongoing, would probably always be ongoing, but it felt manageable now rather than overwhelming. On a warm evening in late August, I stood on my apartment balcony watching the sun set over Boston, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of the lanterns at Victoria's party. But the memory didn't sting the way it once had. It was just a memory now, significant but not defining, part of my story but not the whole of it. I thought about the journal Jennifer had given me, now half filled with thoughts and plans and reflections on the year that had transformed everything. I thought about the companies I'd built, the people I employed, the scholarships I funded, the quiet ways I'd created meaning and value in spaces my family had never thought to look. I thought about the version of myself who'd sat at table 7 behind the bar with my name spelled wrong, who'd absorbed the disgrace comment with practiced grace, who'd known in that moment that something had to change. That version of me felt both very close and impossibly distant. I was still her, still carried the wounds and lessons of 3 decades of invisibility, But I was also someone new. Someone who'd chosen truth over comfort, visibility over peace, authenticity over family harmony. Someone who'd learned that you could love people and still refuse to accept their diminishment of you, that you could value relationships and still walk away when they required you to be less than you were. The city sprawled below me, millions of lights beginning to flicker on as darkness settled, each one representing someone's life, someone's choices, someone's quiet revolution or comfortable compromise. I'd chosen revolution, messy and imperfect as it had been, and I didn't regret it. Not the confrontation, not the fractured relationships, not the complicated aftermath that was still unfolding. Because I'd traded invisibility for presence, silence for voice, their version of me for my own truth. And standing there on my balcony with the summer air warm against my skin and the city lights spreading like stars below, I felt something I'd rarely felt in my family home. In that garden with its roses and champagne and careful performances. I felt free. Not perfectly healed, not without scars or ongoing challenges, but free in the way that mattered most, free to be exactly who I was without apology or accommodation. The garden party would always be part of my story, the night I stopped being invisible and started being undeniable. But it wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of the chapter where I finally became the author of my own life, where I took the pen back and wrote something true. And whatever came next, I would face it as myself, fully and completely, the woman who built an empire while everyone was too busy looking elsewhere to notice. They saw me now. Finally, undeniably, they saw me. And more importantly, I saw myself. That was the real victory. The one that lasted long after the confrontation faded into memory. I'd learned to see my own worth clearly, to value my own achievements honestly, to refuse invisibility as a permanent condition. That knowledge, that clarity, was mine to keep regardless of whether my family ever fully understood what they'd missed, or how much it had cost me to finally claim my place in the light. The story wasn't over, would never be completely over, but it was mine now. Every word, every chapter, every choice moving forward. Mine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.